Lesson 3, a relatively short lesson, all things considered, on why the Berlin Wall ended up being built in 1961. Of course, this is yet another method of how the Soviets kept control of the people in their sphere of influence in the Eastern Bloc. Between 1948 and 1989. The Berlin Wall need not be confused, or the Berlin crisis that leads to the Berlin Wall need not be confused with the Berlin blockade. And they oftentimes are for some reason. I've seen students in a lot of cases write, in 1948, the Berlin Wall was built and the Allies had to fly in supplies. No. These events are actually more than a decade apart. And in 1961, following years of tension over the issue of Berlin between the Allies, the Americans and the British, and the Soviet Union over the flow of people in and out, who should govern Berlin, etc., etc. The Soviets eventually take the decision to split the capital of Germany in two. The former capital of Germany, I suppose, but certainly the capital of East Germany in two in 1961. Now, as I said, on the 13th of August, 61, the people of Berlin literally woke up in the morning to find that their city had been physically divided by an 87-mile-long wall separating east and west. And the wall, actually, the Berlin Wall, goes outside of the rings of the traditional city of Berlin to encompass the entire metropolitan area. But the area we mostly think of as the inner city core, in which there was a particularly long, several kilometer-long wall all the way running through the city. Now, of course, the Russians didn't build a wall overnight. They're not that good. No one is, for that matter. What they actually did is at first use some barbed wire to separate people from getting across the dividing line between the east and west of the city. As we know, Berlin, of course, was the center of the Cold War since 1945, a flashpoint in Cold War tensions. And so really the historic heart of Germany, so therefore, as the country itself was divided by the terms of the Potsdam Agreement, the heart of the conflict. Even though the Soviets and the Americans primarily had been falling out ever since 1945, most people were still surprised that the wall was eventually built. In fact, actually only a few months before, the leader of Eastern Germany actually states that no one has the intention of erecting a wall here. And people in Berlin were legitimately shocked to find that, in fact, the Soviets had ordered a wall to be built. And the wall itself was built, more than anything, to prevent the mass movement of people from east to west. Some pretty sobering statistics if you're the Soviet Union, and ones that certainly hurt your propaganda if you're trying to push the idea that your system is better than theirs. We're looking at 2.6 million East Germans leaving the East for the West before 1949. And by 1961, 15% of the population of East Germany had fled through Berlin to the West. Now, that's pretty striking, especially when you consider why they're doing it and the types of people who are leaving. And that's what we're going to get to right now. So why did people leave? Well, number one, the quality of life in East Germany was much worse than that of the West. As you know from previous lessons and previous units, Stalin had sought to keep Germany down. In other words, he didn't have the interest in rebuilding Germany because he didn't want a powerful Germany to threaten him again. So the quality in his section of life was much, much worse in the East than it was in the West. Of course, the West had received Marshall Plan aid and rebuilt quite quickly after the devastation of World War II. It was symbolism of capitalism, comparative prosperity. And before 1961, East Berliners could travel on the U-Bahn, the Berlin subway, from their homes in East Germany and come out in West Berlin like they were emerging in an entirely different world. East Germany had suffered under the communist system, and a strong degree of control was exhibited on the people of on the East Germans. So in many ways, it's actually surprising that more people didn't actually leave. The impact of these people movement is the other major reason, and this is what really begins to bite. By 1961, you have tremendous social impact. Okay, those that left tended to be the young and well-educated, the people with less ties, more or less, the people who are more free to move. As a result, the Communist Party feared and was experiencing in real ways a brain drain. Okay? The intelligent, young, creative, well-educated people were leaving East Germany for the West, and as a result, East Germany had difficulty finding people to innovate, finding people to work their factories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Economically as well, East Germany had lost too many skilled workers, and as such, only 61% of its population was of working age. The majority of people in East Germany started to be quite old, when 70% of the people in that area of East Germany were of working age before the war. So a large portion, a humongous portion of your population, you're really talking millions of people here, of the age needed to work were gone. Engineers, technicians, physicians, teachers, lawyers, skilled workers were amongst those leaving in the highest numbers. And lastly, and very importantly, when you consider that the Cold War is as much a battle of ideologies as anything else, the mass numbers of people leaving made the communist government look unpopular. Okay? This is negative propaganda in the context of the Cold War, which is as much about proving that your side's better or your ideology is better than the others. So therefore, when you're competing against a capitalist West in a battle for hearts and minds, millions of people leaving and choosing the other side is bad politically. Now, obviously, for these reasons, the Soviets wanted to sort of nip this in the bud. So as the effects of the immigration worsened, the government in East Germany, even though they had promised just months earlier not to, decided to build a wall and as a really only option. Of course, the government in Moscow was really pushing them to do so. And they did this ostensibly to prevent people escaping via Berlin to the west. At first, as I said, the wall was barbed wire. There's actually, interestingly enough, three iterations of the wall. The first is a barbed wire barrier, the second is more of a firm concrete wall, and the third is a multi-layered wall with a space in between filled with mines and guard towers, very much like a prison camp style wall. So the wall evolves over time, and the final really Berlin Wall, the one of that you generally see in pictures, the one you think about when you think of the Berlin Wall, is the one that was finalized in 1969. So it's a little bit of a process to build the wall up to the standard it is. And if you go to Berlin today, you can see the parts of the wall, and those parts of the wall exemplify the wall as it was in its last final vision, 1969. So they didn't wake up to find a wall. It's really important. They woke up to find barbed wire barrier, and then a wall was erected shortly thereafter. You see actually here, this would be the second vision of the wall. This is the people building the first concrete barrier. So the West reaction is rather muted. It's quite interesting, actually. They didn't necessarily protest greatly against the building of the wall. Of course, their own interests are not in any way hurt or affected by the wall. It's really a terrible tragedy for those living in the East, and of course, the Soviets are really looked bad more than anything else, so that helps the Americans. They could still send troops to West Berlin. In fact, also in a strange sense, we don't tend to think about this, the Allies had always worried that the Soviets would invade and just take over all of Berlin, so they had to keep a lot of soldiers in there. In fact, with a concrete barrier dividing the city in two makes it much less likely that you'll get a surprise attack. There's really only a couple ways to get through the wall, and you're not going to be able to get an army with all of its tanks through this barrier unnoticed or quickly at all. So in any ways, the wall does make invasion less likely, so it actually strengthens the Western position in Western Berlin. It's also, crucially for the West, incredible Cold War propaganda. The West claims, of course, that they're on the side of freedom. They're allowing freedom on their side. The communists have to build a wall to keep people into their terrible system. It's great. So yeah, we see that we see that the wall actually doesn't ruffle a lot of feathers in the West. It actually is used, as we'll see from Kennedy's speech, as great propaganda to enforce the correctness of the Western side. The problems of immigration do go away, so I suppose the wall does help keep control. Now, if you're evaluating Soviet control, does the wall help? Yeah. Peace is maintained, but the German people suffer. The Germans feel let down by the USA because Kennedy had not confronted the USSR, but they never really considered loosening their bonds of friendship with the USA, particularly the West Germans, because of course the USA is providing them some protection from the Soviets. Khrushchev necessarily had felt that he had beaten Kennedy and looked for the next way to beat him again. He
think he won the battle over the Berlin Wall, interestingly enough. And we'll see Kennedy as weak because Kennedy doesn't stand up to him, and we'll challenge him again in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we learned about. But he does aim at stemming that flow of refugees, as I say, and the economy in East Germany does improve because they're able to keep their skilled workers, okay? The communists will play the wall up as a positive thing. It will guard the gates of the socialist paradise against corruption of Western idealism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what it means for relations between the Soviet Union and the Americans, well, obviously relations get worse, but of course, if you're looking over at the goal, it does solidify Soviet control over the East. The wall is a symbol that Germany was a tool for the superpowers. Kennedy, in fact, will visit the wall in 1963 and give a very famous speech, which was listened to on both sides of the wall by Berliners. Of course, the speech is made on the wall and broadcast by a loudspeaker into East Germany, and he receives applause from both sides. And he famously says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means I am a Berliner, showing the U.S.'s support for Berlin and, in his eye, the end of the division of Berlin. It's famously misconstrued that he pronounced it wrong, or he said that I am a jelly donut, because Berliner is a type of jelly donut as well. But most Germans knew what he meant, and no one at the time really thought he said I'm a jelly donut. Most people obviously interpreted that it meant I am a Berliner. But Berlin is a high point of tension in the Cold War, and as you can see, the Soviets have to build a wall to keep their control. So we're seeing a pattern developing. The Soviets have to keep control through repressive action to keep their people in line. The Americans try a lot of adventures to contain the growth and spread of communism militarily, but the Soviets try to use repression to keep their people in line. And that is, albeit brief, there isn't a lot to say, but interesting lesson nonetheless on the building of the Berlin Wall. See you in class.